not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son on the altar? Well, Abraham took his son Isaac, and went to sacrifice him on an altar. But he did not complete that work. He had faith, and his faith was shown by his works. But no, he was not righteous for what he did. He was righteous because the sign that he was making was a picture of the righteousness that comes from the cross. God stopped Abraham, and provided a ram as a sign of the ram to come, Jesus Christ. The prophecy of the fulfillment of Abraham's children, and the children that were being spoken about were the children of the promise. Now these children of the promise, are the children who believed by faith. Not just the children of Abraham by genetic code or by birth, because that's what the circumcision was all about. The Messiah was cut off. Now, Abraham was considered righteous when he believed God before he offered his son on the altar. And the prophecy that he was considered righteous was fulfilled at that time, because he was considered righteous at that time by God. This is not a righteousness before men. This is a righteousness before God, because years before Yitzhak was offered on the altar, before Yitzhak was born, there was a conversation between Avram at the time and the father. And the father said, "You're greatly blessed, Avram." And Avram said, "How could I be blessed? I have no children. And a servant in my house is going to inherit all that is mine." And father said, "No. Surely a servant of your household will not have your inheritance. For let me take you outside and look up at the stars and see if you can count them. So shall your offspring be." And at that time, whether it was revealed to him that his offspring was going to be through Christ or not, Avram believed God that his offspring would be as many as the stars. And it was accredited to him as righteousness. This was before the offering on the altar. This was before Yitzhak was even born. James chapter 2 says Avram was considered righteous for what he did. And then there are some people who interpreted, and that's a righteousness before men, which there's no talk about of righteousness. It's silly to even think about what's before men, because it said that the scripture was fulfilled. And the scripture was fulfilled. If James didn't say, "and the scripture was fulfilled," Abraham believed God and it was accredited to him for righteousness, you have to ask yourself the question now. If it's a righteousness before men, but the scripture was fulfilled, that God accredited to him for righteousness for believing, then how can you say it's a righteousness before men when it was a scripture that was fulfilled, and the scripture was fulfilled that said Abraham believed God, who gave him the righteousness for believing, and it was accredited to him by God, not by man. But the problem is that Zane Hodges, Bob Wilkin, all these people, they have a perfect grace gospel except for the book of James. And James chapter 2 takes away every argument that they have. And because that it takes away every argument, they had to play twister with the word. And they twisted the word, and they twisted the words of James to try to say it was a righteousness for men. And everybody else is repeating the mantra. No matter how much you try to get through the thick skull concrete noggins of these idiots, the problem is that if if you accept that James said very plainly that it is not just faith alone, but faith along with works that makes a man righteous, then it blows Zane Hodges and Bob Wilkin and all the free grace movement away, because it puts Christianity back under works, which, by the way, the heretic James would have you do, because he was at that time, whenever he wrote that book, he was wrong. Galatians chapter 2 says, men from James, and they are to be blamed because they were not handling the gospel of aright. This is why he withstood Peter to his face, because men from James had influenced him, and he backed away from the kosher table, the Gentile table, to go to the kosher table, and he was not preaching the gospel aright. The apostle was actually wrong, and if an apostle was wrong, you have to say, well, then how does that square with Scripture? Well, the picture is perfect. The apostle might have written exactly what needed to be written. Though the apostle may have been wrong, the picture was perfect. There was a problem between law and grace, and it needed to be drawn out. And that's why you have it there, so you can see the difference between what Peter being rebuked by Paul, and then Peter changing his tune, and the conflict between James and Paul. It's there. It started when Peter went to the Gentiles. No Jews had ever gone to the Gentiles. Peter went to Cornelius. He ate with Gentiles. He was rebuked by the elders. That would include James. Peter, what have you done? You went in with Gentiles and you ate unkosher food with them? Rebuke, Peter? So Peter was rebuked by men from James beforehand. Then he withdrew from, after being rebuked by James first, by men from James. He went back to the kosher table when he ought not have, and then Paul withstood him to his face. And he was rebuked by Paul. But James and Paul were both rebuked in that same rebuke in Galatians chapter 2. And that's why when you get to the problems that they had in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, those are the things mentioned in Timothy where it says all Scripture is God-breathed. Remember the problems that I had in Antioch? He was talking about Scripture, not the Bible, when it was put together with the book of James slammed in there. He was talking about James not preaching the gospel aright. And watch your doctrine. And because it was put together in this neat little book, and everybody's trying to play Twister to make it work, this is the great deception. They're deceived by James. Most people, I go to many churches, I talk to many people, 99% of the people don't quote the Bible, they quote James. Well, James says this. James says, it's just funny, it's this little book that has no grace in it whatsoever, but 99% of the Christians I walk into quote from it. It has no bearing on, if you read the book, it has no grace in it whatsoever. So you have to wonder, are most Christians duped, and are they really the Antichrist? That's what I would think.